On the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov met with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The two officials appeared briefly before cameras but chose not to make any public opening remarks before beginning their closed-door discussions. The silence in front of the press was striking, symbolizing the heavy weight surrounding this meeting. Both sides were cautious, reflective of how fraught relations have become. The encounter carried particular significance. It came at a moment of deep strain between Washington and Moscow. The war in Ukraine remains the dominant fracture in their relationship, but tensions stretch far beyond that, covering sanctions, nuclear arms control, and global security questions that extend from Europe to the Middle East and Asia. Although no official agenda was released in advance, the very fact of the meeting stood out. In recent years, top-level diplomacy between the United States and Russia has been rare, often overshadowed by military maneuvers, sanctions packages, and mutual accusations. Yet here, within the halls of the United Nations, two senior figures sat down at the same table, even if only for a limited exchange. Diplomatic observers quickly noted that the optics themselves mattered. While neither Lavrov nor Rubio addressed the press, the cameras captured them walking side by side, greeting one another with a restrained nod and moving behind closed doors. In today's climate, even this simple choreography sends a message. Dialogue has not been entirely severed. Relations between the United States and Russia are currently described by many diplomats as being at their lowest point since the Cold War. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has cemented this rift. Washington continues to provide large-scale military, financial, and intelligence support to Kyiv, while Moscow denounces US involvement as direct interference in what it calls its special military operation. American officials insist the support is necessary to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty against aggression. Russian officials, on the other hand, frame the conflict as a broader struggle against NATO expansion and Western dominance. It is in this context that Lavrov and Rubio's meeting took place, an arena where every word, or in this case, the lack of words, is scrutinized for deeper meaning. Lavrov, a seasoned diplomat with decades of experience, has long served as the face of Russian foreign policy on the global stage. For him, meetings at the UN are a stage to project Moscow's narrative and reinforce Russia's position as a world power unwilling to be isolated. Rubio, stepping into his role as US Secretary of State, represents a Washington line that balances firmness with the recognition that certain channels of communication must remain open. As the door closed behind them, speculation quickly spread among journalists and analysts. Were they discussing Ukraine directly? Was the focus on sanctions relief, prisoner exchanges, nuclear treaties, or broader issues like Middle Eastern instability? While the specifics remain undisclosed, the themes were predictable. The war in Ukraine continues to dominate not only bilateral ties, but also the agenda of the entire United Nations. Every year since the invasion began, the General Assembly has been marked by fierce speeches, walkouts, and rival resolutions. The fact that the meeting was held during the Assembly signals that both nations still see value in face-to-face conversation, even if they fundamentally disagree. One diplomat in New York described it as a low bar, but a necessary one. Another observer suggested that the absence of opening statements was deliberate, a way of ensuring the conversation could proceed without political posturing in front of the press. The meeting also reflects a broader historical pattern. During the Cold War, US and Soviet officials often met quietly, sometimes without fanfare, even while publicly denouncing one another. Those encounters, while not producing dramatic breakthroughs, help manage crises and prevent escalation. Many analysts see echoes of that history in today's moment. For Washington, one key issue is the continued detention of US citizens in Russia, including journalists and former Marines whose cases have drawn widespread attention. Past high-level meetings have sometimes paved the way for prisoner swaps, a form of pragmatic diplomacy that continues despite broader hostility. For Moscow, the top agenda item is sanctions relief. Since the invasion of Ukraine, sweeping US and European sanctions have targeted Russian banks, energy exports, technology transfers, and even luxury goods. These sanctions have squeezed Russia's economy, restricted its access to Western markets, and symbolically isolated it from the global financial system. Inside the UN, the Russian delegation has consistently argued that sanctions are illegal, unilateral measures that harm ordinary citizens. Lavrov has used nearly every major speech in recent years to denounce them. The US, by contrast, defends the sanctions as essential pressure designed to weaken Moscow's war effort. It is almost certain that in some form, these conflicting perspectives resurfaced in the private exchange between Lavrov and Rubio. Beyond sanctions and Ukraine, the broader question of nuclear arms control looms large. With the collapse of the INF Treaty and uncertainty surrounding the future of New START, one of the last remaining nuclear agreements between the two powers, global security experts warn of a dangerous vacuum. Even in moments of severe rivalry, Washington and Moscow have historically maintained dialogue on nuclear issues. Whether this meeting touched on those concerns remains unclear, but the context suggests it could hardly be avoided. The United Nations General Assembly provided a vivid backdrop for all of this. Leaders from across the world had gathered in New York, delivering speeches that highlighted the fractures of today's international order. In this environment, a one-hour conversation between two officials may seem modest, but for many, it was a reminder that diplomacy remains alive, even if diminished. The meeting itself lasted less than 2 hours, according to diplomatic sources. Neither side released an official readout immediately afterward. This silence was interpreted by some as a sign that discussions were exploratory, not yet ripe for public framing. Others saw it as an indication that sensitive topics, perhaps concerning Ukraine or nuclear matters, were at the center. In the press corps, the absence of details fueled a flurry of analysis. Commentators debated whether the encounter marked a thaw, however slight, or whether it was simply a necessary performance of diplomacy at a time when open hostility dominates rhetoric. At the same time, regional allies of both Washington and Moscow watched carefully. European diplomats noted that any sign of US-Russia dialogue would be significant for the trajectory of the war in Ukraine and for broader European security. Meanwhile, countries in the global south, many of whom have tried to maintain neutrality, saw the meeting as a small opportunity for easing tensions that have spilled into global energy markets and food supply chains. Sergey Lavrov has long insisted that Russia will not be isolated. In past remarks, he has criticized the West for what he describes as neo-colonial attitudes and has sought to build closer ties with nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This meeting with the US, however, shows that despite outreach elsewhere, Russia still recognizes the importance of engaging its main rival directly. Marco Rubio, representing Washington's approach, has echoed the long-standing American line. Support for Ukraine will remain firm, sanctions will continue, but communication channels will not be entirely closed. For American policymakers, maintaining dialogue prevents miscalculation and signals to allies that the US is both strong and pragmatic. As one analyst put it, diplomacy is not about liking or trusting the other side, it is about managing risks. In that sense, the Lavrov-Rubio meeting was not about breakthroughs, but about ensuring that the world's two nuclear superpowers keep talking. The symbolism of holding such a conversation in New York under the roof of the UN cannot be ignored. The General Assembly, despite its limitations, remains one of the few arenas where adversaries can sit down in close proximity, away from battlefields and sanction lists. When asked informally about the tone of the meeting, one diplomat familiar with the encounter described it as serious, restrained, and absolutely without illusions. That in itself might be the most accurate reflection of US-Russia relations today. Dialogue without optimism, engagement without expectation. In sum, while no dramatic announcements followed, the encounter was important simply because it happened. In an era where relations are defined by confrontation, the act of meeting remains meaningful. For observers of global diplomacy, Lavrov and Rubio's face-to-face discussion was a reminder that even in the darkest periods, channels of communication must be preserved. And so, in New York, against the backdrop of speeches, protests, and global headlines, the two officials met. They did not speak to the cameras, they did not offer platitudes, and they did not pretend that relations are anything other than hostile. But they met, and for now, that is the story. The meeting underscores the continued, if limited, diplomatic engagement between the United States and Russia, even as relations remain at their lowest point in decades.